Welcome back to another journey through the quieter corridors of history. Tonight, we're stepping into a world where power wore many masks, some gilded, some grotesque, all strangely human in their extremes. Before you settle in completely, if you enjoy what we do here, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And I'm always curious, let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. There's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all scattered across the world, yet sharing these same old stories. Now, dim the lights, find your most comfortable position, and let's wander together through the strange world of tyrants. Not the cartoonish villains of legend, but the complicated, often deeply troubled individuals who held absolute power over millions of lives. Power, you see, has always been a peculiar thing. It promises everything and delivers a kind of magnificent isolation. Tonight, we'll visit 4 different corners of this isolation, from the opulent halls of peace, Belgian royalty to the marble corridors of ancient Rome, from the carefully constructed mythology of North Korea to the intimate chambers where Napoleon's ambitions quietly festered. These aren't tales of heroes or monsters, but of human beings who found themselves in possession of something that perhaps no human being should ever possess: the ability to reshape the world according to their will, their fears, their increasingly fragmented understanding of reality. So let us begin, as we so often do, by placing ourselves gently into the shoes of someone who witnessed it all. Verse 1. The Golden Cage, Life as a Courtier, under King Leopold II Brussels, 1885. Imagine yourself as a young courtier in the court of King Leopold II of Belgium. You are 23 years old, well-educated, from a respectable family with just enough noble blood to grant you access to these rarefied circles. Your position is secure, but not exalted. You are trusted enough to be present, invisible enough to be ignored. The morning light filters through the tall windows of the Palace of Laeken, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. You have learned to walk softly here, your leather shoes making only the faintest whisper against the stone. The palace itself seems to hold its breath, as if even the building understands the weight of the secrets it contains. Your day begins at dawn, as it always does, with the careful ritual of preparation. You dress in the prescribed manner dark morning coat, perfectly pressed trousers, a tie that must be neither too elaborate nor too plain. Everything about your appearance must suggest competence and respectability, but never enough personality to be memorable. This is the art of court survival: to be present without being noticed, useful without being indispensable. You make your way through the corridors you've come to know by heart. The palace is a maze of interconnected rooms, each more opulent than the last. Here, a drawing room lined with silk wallpaper imported from Paris. There, a library whose leather-bound volumes seem to absorb sound itself. The air carries the perpetual scent of beeswax polish and fresh flowers, arrangements that are replaced daily by silent servants who appear and disappear like ghosts. The king's routine is as rigid as clockwork, and you've learned to synchronize your movements with his habits. He rises at precisely 6 o'clock, takes his breakfast alone in the small morning room overlooking the gardens, and begins his correspondence by 7:30. You know this not because you've been told, but because you've learned to read the subtle rhythms of the palace, the way the servants' footsteps quicken at certain hours, the way particular doors remain closed until specific moments. By 8 o'clock, you're positioned in the anteroom outside his private study, along with 3 other courtiers of similar rank. You wait. Waiting, you've discovered, is perhaps the most important skill a courtier can develop. Not the restless waiting of anxiety, but the patient, alert waiting of a cat watching a mouse hole. You must be ready to spring into action while appearing completely at ease. The king emerges at 8:45, and you feel that familiar flutter of nervous attention that his presence always provokes. Leopold II is a man of imposing stature, tall, broad-shouldered, with a magnificent beard that seems to command respect all by itself. But it's his eyes that you notice most, pale, calculating, with a quality of attention that makes you feel as though he's cataloging your usefulness, even as he appears to ignore you entirely. "The morning dispatches," he says, his voice carrying the particular authority of someone who has never questioned whether he will be obeyed. You step forward with the leather portfolio, careful to keep your movements smooth and deferential. As he takes it from your hands, you catch a whiff of his cologne, something expensive and faintly exotic, with notes of bergamot and something else you can't quite identify. You retreat to your position and watch as he reads. This is when you learn to observe without appearing to do so. The king's face is a study in controlled expression, but you've developed the ability to read the subtle signs. The slight tightening around his eyes when news displeases him, the way his fingers drum against the desk when he's considering some complex decision. Today, like most days, several of the dispatches concern the Congo Free State. The king never discusses these matters openly in your presence, but you've pieced together enough fragments of conversation to understand that this distant African territory is the source of both his greatest pride and his most carefully guarded anxieties. You watch him set aside certain documents in a particular pile. These will be handled privately. You know, in meetings to which courtiers like yourself are never invited, there's a whole layer of the king's business that exists in shadow, managed by a select group of advisors who move through the palace like figures in a different play entirely. The morning audience begins at 10 o'clock. This is when you see Leopold II in his role as the beloved monarch of the Belgians. A steady stream of visitors arrives: government ministers, foreign dignitaries, representatives from various charitable organizations that the king patronizes. You stand at your designated position along the wall, a human piece of furniture, available for whatever small service might be required. What strikes you most during these audiences is the king's remarkable ability to project different versions of himself, depending on his audience. With the ministers, he's the shrewd politician, asking pointed questions and offering subtle guidance. With the foreign dignitaries, he becomes the cultured European monarch, discussing art and literature with genuine knowledge and enthusiasm. With the charity representatives, he transforms into the benevolent father figure, concerned with the welfare of his subjects. But you, invisible in your corner, sometimes catch glimpses of something else moments when the mask slips slightly, when you see a flash of the man beneath the monarch. It might be the way his jaw tightens when a minister mentions budgetary constraints, or the brief, cold assessment that crosses his features when he thinks no one is watching. The most telling moments come during the brief interludes between appointments. Left alone, Leopold II's face settles into an expression of profound calculation. He stares out the tall windows toward the gardens, but you sense he's not really seeing the carefully manicured lawns and flower beds. His mind is elsewhere, perhaps in the dense forests of the Congo, perhaps in the counting houses where his investments multiply, perhaps in some future that only he can envision. Lunch is served at precisely 1 o'clock in the small dining room adjacent to his study. Today, as on most days, the king dines alone, though you and the other courtiers remain nearby in case you're needed. The meal is elaborate, but consumed with mechanical efficiency. You've noticed that Leopold II eats like a man who views food as fuel rather than pleasure necessary, but not particularly interesting. It's during lunch that you often overhear fragments of telephone conversations. The king has embraced this new technology with enthusiasm, and he conducts business calls while eating, the black receiver cradled against his ear as he cuts his meat with surgical precision. The conversations are always in French, conducted in the kind of careful, diplomatic language that reveals nothing while suggesting everything. Yes, the reports from Boma are satisfactory, you hear him say on this particular day. The efficiency improvements have exceeded expectations. There's a pause as he listens to the voice on the other end. Naturally, there are always complications when dealing with such a diverse workforce. But these matters are being handled with appropriate discretion. You don't understand the full implications of these coded conversations but you sense their weight. There's something in the king's tone, a particular quality of controlled satisfaction that suggests matters of great importance are being discussed. Later, you'll learn that Boma is a town in the Congo, and that efficiency improvements and diverse workforce are euphemisms for things that no courtier in Brussels is ever meant to fully comprehend. The afternoon brings a different rhythm to the palace. This is when Leopold II retreats to his private apartments for what he calls his contemplative hours. You're dismissed from immediate attendance, free to pursue your own duties managing correspondence, organizing documents, attending to the 100 small tasks that keep the machinery of monarchy running smoothly. But even during these hours of relative freedom, you remain aware of the king's presence. The palace has its own acoustic signature, and you've learned to read the sounds that carry through the corridors. The creak of floorboards overhead tells you when he's pacing in his study, something he does when wrestling with particularly complex decisions. The murmur of voices from behind closed doors indicates when his private advisors have arrived for their clandestine meetings. These are the men you rarely see, but whose influence permeates everything. The financiers who manage the king's personal investments, the administrators who oversee his African territories, the journalists and publicists who craft his public image. They arrive through private entrances, conduct their business in soundproofed rooms, and depart like smoke. On rare occasions, you catch glimpses of documents left momentarily unguarded, reports bearing official seals, telegrams with urgent markings, letters written in multiple languages. The glimpses are brief and fragmentary, but they hint at the vast machinery of exploitation and control that extends from this quiet palace to territories on the other side of the world. The evening routine begins at 6 o'clock with the king's personal grooming ritual. You're not directly involved in this process, but you coordinate with the valets and attendants who are. Leopold II is meticulous about his appearance. His beard must be trimmed to precise specifications, his clothing pressed and arranged just so. This attention to detail extends to every aspect of his public presentation. Dinner is often a social affair, with carefully selected guests drawn from Brussels' elite society. These evenings reveal yet another facet of the king's complex personality. He becomes animated, charming, displaying an encyclopedic knowledge of art, music, and literature. He tells amusing anecdotes about his travels, discusses architectural projects with genuine passion, and demonstrates a surprisingly dry sense of humor. You serve during these dinners, moving silently between the kitchen and dining room, ensuring that wine glasses never empty and that each course appears at precisely the right moment. The conversations flow around you in French, German, and occasionally English, touching on topics both mundane and significant. What strikes you most is how completely separate this social Leopold II seems from the calculating figure you observe during his business hours. Here, surrounded by admirers and sycophants, he appears genuinely relaxed, even jovial. He laughs at others' wit, compliments the ladies on their gowns, and plays the role of the cultured European monarch to perfection. But you've developed the ability to see beyond performance, and occasionally you catch glimpses of the man behind the mask. A brief flicker of impatience when a guest talks too long. A moment of cold assessment when someone ventures an opinion about colonial policy. The way his fingers drum against his wine glass when the conversation turns to topics that bore him. The most revealing moments come during the brief silences that punctuate even the most animated dinner parties. In these interludes, Leopold II's face settles into an expression of distant contemplation, as if part of his mind is always elsewhere, wrestling with problems and possibilities that his dinner guests couldn't begin to imagine. After the guests depart, usually around 11 o'clock, the palace settles into its nighttime rhythm. You remain on duty for another hour, attending to final tasks and ensuring that everything is prepared for the following day. The king retires to his private chambers, but lights remain burning in certain offices throughout the night. The Congo never sleeps, And neither, it seems, does the machinery that manages it. Your final duty each evening is to prepare the next day's appointment calendar and ensure that all necessary documents are organized and readily accessible. As you work in the quiet administrative offices, you sometimes hear the faint sound of footsteps from the floor above the king, unable to sleep, pacing in his chambers. It's during these late-night hours that you sometimes allow yourself to truly reflect on your position. You are witness to power in its most intimate form, yet you understand so little of what you observe. You see the performance, a carefully managed presentation, but the true nature of Leopold II's reign remains as opaque as ever. What you do understand, with growing clarity, is that you serve a man who exists in a state of magnificent isolation. For all his social graces and public ceremonies, Leopold II is fundamentally alone with the weight of his ambitions and the burden of his secrets. The palace, for all its opulence, is essentially a gilded cage, not just for you and the other courtiers, but for the king himself. As you finally make your way to your own modest chambers in the palace's upper floors, you carry with you the accumulated weight of another day spent in proximity to power. Tomorrow will bring more of the same: the careful observation, the deferential service, the gradual accumulation of fragments that never quite form a complete picture. But you've learned something important during your time at court. Tyrants are not born fully formed from some mythical realm of evil. They are created gradually, day by day, through the accumulation of small compromises and the steady erosion of human connection. Leopold II is a man who has surrounded himself with so many layers of protection and privilege that he may have forgotten what it feels like to be simply, genuinely human. And as you drift off to sleep in your narrow bed, with the sound of distant footsteps still echoing from above, you understand that you are both witness to and participant in this strange transformation, this slow metamorphosis of a man into something else entirely. Verse 2. The Emperor's Menagerie, Caligula's Rome. The marble corridors of the Palatine Hill whisper different secrets now. We leave behind the calculated restraint of 19th century Brussels and step backward through time to a Rome where power wore no mask at all, where the distance between imperial whim and imperial decree had collapsed entirely. It is the year 39, and Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula, has been emperor for 2 years. The nickname, meaning little boots, was earned in childhood when he accompanied his father's military campaigns dressed in a miniature soldier's uniform. Now, at 27, those little boots have grown to fill the sandals of absolute power, and Rome is learning what happens when unlimited authority meets an increasingly untethered mind. The transformation had been gradual at first, almost imperceptible. When Caligula first assumed power, Rome had breathed a collective sigh of relief. After the paranoid final years of Tiberius, the young emperor seemed to promise a return to the golden days of Augustus. He was generous with gladiatorial games, recalled political exiles, and distributed bonuses to the Praetorian Guard. The people loved him. The Senate, cautiously, approved. But power, like a fever, had begun to work its changes. The first signs were subtle a tendency toward grandiose building projects, an increased interest in the ceremonial aspects of divinity that surrounded the imperial office. Romans had grown accustomed to their emperors being declared gods after death. Caligula began to blur the line between mortality and divinity while still very much alive. The palace itself had become a reflection of his evolving psyche. What had once been impressive but tasteful displays of imperial wealth transformed into something approaching theatrical excess. Gold leaf appeared on surfaces that had never required it. Statues multiplied in corridors where they served no purpose beyond reinforcing the emperor's image. The very air seemed thick with incense, as if the palace were a temple and ordinary life a form of continuous worship. His daily routine had evolved into something between imperial business and elaborate performance art. The morning salutatio, the traditional greeting ceremony, where citizens and dignitaries paid respects to the emperor, became increasingly surreal. Caligula would receive visitors dressed in costumes that ranged from military regalia to the flowing robes of various gods. On some days, he appeared as Jupiter, complete with false beard and thunderbolt prop. On others, he might receive senators while dressed as Venus, his face painted and adorned with feminine jewelry. The senators, those dignified representatives of Rome's ancient republican traditions, found themselves in the peculiar position of conducting serious state business with a man who might be wearing a dress. They adapted, as humans always do when survival is at stake, developing the ability to discuss tax policy and military deployments while maintaining appropriately serious expressions in the face of their emperor's theatrical presentations. But it was Caligula's relationship with animals that revealed, perhaps, the most telling aspects of his psychological landscape. The imperial menagerie had always been impressive lions from Africa, bears from the northern forests, exotic birds from the farthest reaches of the empire. Under Caligula, it became something approaching an alternate court, populated with creatures who seemed to receive more consistent affection and attention than most human courtiers. His horse, Incitatus, became the most famous resident of this animal court. The name meant swift, and the horse was indeed a magnificent specimen, a pale stallion with an intelligent eye and aristocratic bearing. What began as typical imperial indulgence in fine horseflesh evolved into something far more complex. Incitatus lived in a marble stall, appointed with ivory mangers and purple blankets. He wore a collar of precious stones and was attended by servants whose sole responsibility was his comfort and grooming. The horse dined on oats mixed with gold flakes and drank from goblets that would not have been out of place at the finest Roman tables. But the relationship went deeper than mere extravagance. Caligula would spend hours in the stables, speaking to Incitatus in a low, confidential tone that he rarely used with human companions. Observers noted that the emperor seemed more relaxed, more genuinely himself, in the presence of his horse than in any other circumstance. The animal provided something that the complex web of imperial relationships could not: uncomplicated acceptance. The famous story that Caligula planned to make, Incitatus a consul one of Rome's highest elected offices, may have been exaggerated by hostile historians, but it captured a deeper truth about the emperor's relationship with both power and trust. In a world where every human interaction was filtered through considerations of advantage and survival, the horse represented something pure, a relationship untainted by ambition or betrayal. The broader menagerie reflected the same psychological pattern. Caligula surrounded himself with creatures who could not plot against him, could not question his decisions, could not remind him of the growing gap between his fantasies and reality. He kept exotic birds that he claimed could speak prophecies, though their utterances seemed to consist mainly of mimicked phrases that the emperor had taught them himself. His collection of big cats included several lions and leopards that he would visit daily, sometimes entering their enclosures against the desperate protests of their keepers. These dangerous encounters seemed to provide him with a particular type of thrill, the sensation of power over creatures that could easily destroy him if they chose to do so. It was, perhaps, the closest he could come to experiencing genuine vulnerability while still maintaining absolute control. The emperor's relationship with his pets became increasingly central to the routine of palace life. Important state decisions were delayed if they conflicted with feeding schedules. Diplomatic meetings were rearranged to accommodate the emperor's desire to exercise his favorite hunting dogs. The rhythm of the Roman Empire, in small but significant ways, began to synchronize with the needs and whims of creatures who had no understanding of politics, economics, or military strategy. This animal-centric worldview extended to Caligula's public appearances and ceremonial functions. He began to incorporate his pets into official state occasions, appearing at games and festivals with exotic birds perched on his shoulders or leading his favorite hunting dogs through crowds of amazed citizens. What might have seemed charmingly eccentric in a private citizen took on more unsettling implications when displayed by the most powerful man in the known world. The emperor's growing identification with divinity found expression in his treatment of his animal companions as well. He declared several of his pets to be sacred, demanding that they receive the same reverence accorded to religious icons. Citizens were expected to bow to his horse with the same respect they would show to a statue of Jupiter. Failure to observe these courtesies could result in charges of impiety, a serious crime that carried severe penalties. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of Caligula's relationship with his menagerie was the way it reflected his increasing isolation from human connection. Surrounded by courtiers who told him only what they thought he wanted to hear, by senators who feared to contradict him, by family members whose love was complicated by terror, the emperor found in his animals the uncomplicated acceptance that had become impossible in his human relationships. His conversations with his pets, overheard by nervous servants, revealed a man who was becoming increasingly aware of his own psychological deterioration, but seemed powerless to stop it. He would confess fears and doubts to his horse that he could never voice to his advisors. He would rage about perceived betrayals to his hunting dogs with an honesty that would have been fatal if overheard by human ears. The palace staff learned to navigate this strange new reality with the adaptability that has always characterized those who serve power. They developed elaborate protocols for the care and feeding of the imperial menagerie. They learned to recognize the emperor's moods based on which animals he chose to visit on any given day. They discovered that approaching Caligula when he was with his pets often resulted in more favorable receptions than formal appointments in the throne room. The broader implications of this shift were not lost on Rome's more thoughtful observers. The emperor's preference for animal companionship over human relationships represented, in microcosm, his growing disconnection from the very people he was meant to govern. How could a man who found horses more trustworthy than senators make decisions that affected millions of human lives? Yet the menagerie also provided a kind of stabilizing influence on Caligula's increasingly erratic behavior. His genuine care for his animals represented one of the few remaining connections to his capacity for affection and concern. When political pressures became overwhelming, when the weight of imperial responsibility threatened to crush what remained of his sanity, he could retreat to the stables and spend hours grooming his horse or feeding treats to his exotic birds. These moments of animal-focused calm became increasingly important as Caligula's reign progressed into more dangerous territory. His public pronouncements grew more grandiose and disconnected from political reality. His treatment of the Senate became openly contemptuous. His fiscal policies, driven by the enormous expense of his building projects and entertainment spectacles, pushed the empire toward financial crisis. But in the quiet hours spent with his menagerie, something approaching the original Caligula could still be glimpsed. The young man who had once been beloved by Roman citizens, who had shown promise of wise and benevolent rule. His horses and dogs and exotic birds knew nothing of his failures as an emperor. To them, he was simply the human who provided food and attention and affection. In their presence, he could briefly escape the crushing weight of expectations and disappointments that surrounded his public role. The tragic irony was that this retreat into animal companionship, while providing psychological relief, only accelerated his disconnection from the human world he was supposed to govern. Each hour spent in the stables was an hour not spent learning about the concerns of his citizens. Each intimate conversation with his horse was a conversation not held with advisors who might have guided him toward wiser policies. The menagerie became, in essence, a luxurious prison of his own creation, a place where Caligula could feel powerful and loved and understood, but only by creatures who could never challenge him to become a better ruler or a wiser man. It was the perfect metaphor for the isolation that tyranny creates. Surrounded by subjects who dare not speak truth, the tyrant seeks comfort in relationships that demand nothing and offer nothing in return but the illusion of uncomplicated devotion. As Rome watched its emperor disappear ever deeper into this animal-focused fantasy, the more perceptive citizens began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented and deeply disturbing. The empire was being governed, in effect, by a man who had chosen to live as much as possible in a world where his word was not law, but love, where his power was not feared, but welcomed, where his increasingly tenuous grip on reality was not challenged, but accepted with the unquestioning loyalty that only animals can provide. Verse 3. The architecture of devotion. Daily life in Kim Il-sung's North Korea. We leave the marble excess of ancient Rome and step forward through centuries, across continents, to a different kind of palace, entirely one, built not of stone and gold, but of carefully constructed mythology and meticulously orchestrated devotion. Here, in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea of the 1970s, we encounter tyranny in its most modern form. The systematic transformation of an entire society into a living shrine to one man's vision of himself. The morning begins, as all mornings do in Pyongyang, with music. At precisely 6 o'clock, loudspeakers throughout the city crackle to life with the opening notes of Song of General Kim Il-sung. Tee-hee melody drifts through apartment windows, echoes off the facades of newly constructed buildings, and mingles with the sound of 10,000 people beginning their daily rituals of preparation, not just for work, but for another day of performed devotion. In a modest apartment on the 7th floor of a residential block in the Moranbong district, a family of 4 moves through their morning routine with the precision of long practice. The father, a mid-level functionary in the Ministry of Agriculture, rises first and immediately adjusts the portraits on the living room wall 2 frames containing photographs of Kim Il-sung and his deceased predecessor, both positioned at the exact height and angle prescribed by regulation. These images are not mere decoration. They are the household's most precious possessions, cleaned daily with special cloths and regarded with the reverence other cultures reserve for religious icons. The apartment itself tells the story of a society remade according to one man's vision. Every detail, from the furniture arrangement to the books on the shelves, reflects not personal taste, but adherence to an elaborate system of behavioral expectations. The radio, permanently tuned to the state broadcasting station, provides a constant soundtrack of educational programming, patriotic music, and regular updates on the great leader's activities and thoughts. The family's breakfast conversation unfolds according to patterns established over decades of careful social conditioning. The children, aged 12 and 15, share what they've learned in their political education classes. The daughter recites a poem about the great leader's childhood. The son discusses his upcoming participation in a youth volunteer project designed to beautify the city in preparation for an important anniversary celebration. These conversations are not performances in the conventional sense. The family genuinely believes in the content of their morning discussions. This is perhaps the most remarkable achievement of the North Korean system, the creation of a society where performed devotion and genuine belief have become virtually indistinguishable, even to those who live within it. The mother, a teacher at a local primary school, reviews her lesson plans while eating. Today she will be teaching a history class about the great leader's revolutionary activities during the Japanese occupation. The curriculum she follows has been crafted with extraordinary attention to detail, weaving together historical facts, heroic mythology, and moral instruction into a seamless narrative that positions Kim Il-sung not merely as a political leader, but as the embodiment of Korean national identity itself. The textbooks she uses are marvels of ideological engineering. Every page has been designed not just to convey information, but to cultivate specific emotional responses. The illustrations show Kim Il-sung in various heroic poses leading guerrilla fighters through mountain forests, studying by candlelight, surrounded by adoring children. The text employs a distinctive rhetorical style. It combines the language of historical documentation with the elevated tone traditionally reserved for religious scripture. But the most sophisticated aspect of this educational system is not what it includes, but what it omits. Alternative narratives about Korean history, different interpretations of the Korean War, competing visions of economic development. These exist only as carefully constructed straw men, introduced solely to be definitively refuted. The students learn not just what to think, but how to think, developing mental habits that make certain questions literally unthinkable. The father's workplace, a regional agricultural planning office, represents another facet of this comprehensive system of social organization. The building itself is unremarkable functional concrete architecture that prioritizes efficiency over beauty. But the interior space has been carefully designed to reinforce the omnipresence of the great leader's guidance and wisdom. Every office contains its mandatory portraits, positioned so that they're visible from any workstation. Conference rooms feature additional images showing Kim Il-sung visiting agricultural sites, inspecting crops, offering guidance to farmers. These photographs serve multiple purposes simultaneously. They provide visual reminders of the leader's interest in agricultural development. They suggest his personal accessibility and concern for ordinary workers. And they create an atmosphere in which all discussions and decisions feel as though they're being conducted under his benevolent supervision. The work itself reflects the peculiar economics of a command system built around the principle of ideological purity rather than material efficiency. Production targets are set not through market analysis or resource assessment, but through complex calculations that factor in political considerations alongside practical ones. The goal is not merely to grow food, but to demonstrate the superiority of the Korean socialist system under the great leader's guidance. This means that agricultural planning meetings often involve extensive discussions of how various crop selections and farming techniques align with Kim Il-sung's published thoughts on rural development. His collected writings, volumes of speeches, essays, and policy directives function as a kind of secular scripture, consulted not just for practical guidance, but for moral and philosophical direction. The father has learned to navigate these ideological requirements with skill developed over years of practice. He can quote relevant passages from the great leader's agricultural writings. He understands which farming techniques are politically favored regardless of their practical effectiveness. And he knows how to frame productivity discussions in terms of revolutionary struggle and national pride. But perhaps most importantly, he has internalized the system's fundamental logic. That technical questions are never merely technical, that every decision reflects broader questions of loyalty and commitment, that competence and ideological correctness are not separate qualities, but different aspects of the same revolutionary consciousness. The children's school experience provides the most intensive example of how this comprehensive system of social conditioning operates. The school day begins with the singing of patriotic songs, continues with lessons that integrate academic content with political education, and includes regular periods specifically devoted to studying the great leader's life and teachings. The 12-year-old daughter's mathematics textbook presents word problems involving the construction of monuments to Kim Il-sung, the calculation of grain production increases achieved through application of his agricultural theories, and the determination of optimal angles for displaying his portrait in various settings. Mathematics becomes a vehicle for reinforcing the centrality of the great leader to every aspect of Korean life. Her older brother's literature classes focus heavily on works that celebrate the revolutionary struggle and Kim Il-sung's role in it. But the curriculum also includes carefully selected examples of international literature, stories, and poems that have been chosen because they can be interpreted as supporting the values and worldview promoted by the North Korean system. The students learn to read these texts through a particular ideological lens, developing analytical skills that are genuinely sophisticated within their specific context, but that also function to reinforce predetermined conclusions about the superiority of their society and the wisdom of their leadership. Physical education classes incorporate military-style training and group choreography designed for mass displays of national unity. The children learn to march in precise formations, to coordinate complex dance routines that spell out patriotic slogans, and to participate in the elaborate synchronized performances that are a distinctive feature of North Korean public culture. These activities serve multiple functions simultaneously. They provide physical exercise. They develop discipline and coordination. They create opportunities for collective bonding. And they prepare the children to participate in the mass spectacles that are central to the regime's public presentation of itself. The afternoon brings the family together for what has become a daily ritual in households throughout North Korea: the collective viewing of the evening news broadcast. The program follows a predictable format: reports on Kim Il-sung's activities, coverage of economic achievements and socialist construction projects, international news presented from a perspective that emphasizes the superiority of the Korean system, and cultural segments featuring performances that celebrate revolutionary themes. But the most significant aspect of this shared viewing experience is not the content itself, but the way it functions as a form of family bonding organized around collective participation in the national political culture. The parents explain complex political concepts to their children. The children ask questions that demonstrate their growing understanding of approved perspectives, and the entire family engages in discussions that reinforce their shared commitment to the values and goals promoted by the regime. The evening concludes with preparation for the next day's activities. The children complete homework assignments that often involve memorizing speeches by Kim Il-sung or preparing presentations about various aspects of Korean revolutionary history. The parents review work-related materials that frequently include new policy directives or ideological guidance issued by the central leadership. But perhaps the most telling aspect of this daily routine is how completely it has normalized the integration of political devotion into every aspect of private life. The family does not experience their constant attention to Kim Il-sung's teachings and example as an intrusion or burden. Instead, they have come to understand this focus as the natural expression of their identity as Korean citizens and as the foundation of their personal and collective well-being. This represents perhaps the most sophisticated achievement of the North Korean system: the creation of a form of social organization in which political control operates not primarily through fear or coercion, but through the systematic cultivation of genuine emotional attachment and intellectual commitment. The great leader has become not merely a political figure, but a focal point for feelings and loyalties that in other societies might be distributed among family members, religious institutions, cultural traditions, and personal interests. The regime has succeeded in creating a form of concentrated devotion that provides its citizens with a sense of purpose, identity, and belonging while simultaneously ensuring their complete political compliance. The result is a society that functions as a kind of living monument to one man's vision of leadership and social organization. Every conversation, every lesson, every work project, every moment of leisure becomes an opportunity to demonstrate and reinforce loyalty to Kim Il-sung and commitment to the revolutionary goals he represents. It is tyranny perfected through love, rather than fear, a system in which the distinction between oppressor and oppressed has been dissolved into a collective identity organized around shared devotion to an idealized father figure who embodies all wisdom, all virtue, and all hope for the future. And as the family settles into sleep, surrounded by the portraits that watch over their dreams, they do so with the deep satisfaction of people who know exactly where they belong in the world and exactly what is expected of them, a certainty purchased at the cost of every other form of human possibility. Segment 4, The Servant's Eye in Napoleon's Shadow. We step now into a different kind of intimacy with power, away from the orchestrated devotion of modern totalitarianism and the public spectacles of imperial Rome, into the private chambers where ambition wore the mask of domesticity. Here, in the Tuileries Palace during the winter of 1807, we encounter tyranny in its most subtle form, not as grand performance or systematic indoctrination, but as the quiet accumulation of small compromises that transform both ruler and ruled. You are Marie Claire Dubois, 34 years old, employed as a lady's maid in the household of the Emperor Napoleon and Empress Josephine. Your position is neither exalted nor insignificant. You exist in that essential middle realm of palace life, trusted enough to witness private moments, invisible enough to be overlooked when sensitive conversations unfold in your presence. Your day begins in the pre-dawn darkness, as it has for the past 3 years since entering imperial service. The palace never truly sleeps. There are always lights burning in various offices, always the soft footsteps of servants moving through corridors on necessary errands. But these early hours, between 4 and 6 in the morning, represent the closest thing to quiet that this vast machine of governance and ceremony ever achieves. You dress by candlelight in your modest chamber on the 4th floor, where the servants' quarters occupy a world both parallel to and completely separate from the grand apartments below. Your clothing is prescribed by regulation dark wool dress, white apron, hair carefully arranged and covered. Every aspect of your appearance must suggest competence and respectability without drawing attention to yourself as an individual. The Emperor's routine has become as familiar to you as your own heartbeat, though you rarely see him directly. He rises at varying hours, depending on the previous night's activities and the day's scheduled obligations. But his morning preparations follow an invariable pattern. The valet handles his personal grooming and dressing, while you attend to the Empress and coordinate with the other household staff to ensure that everything Napoleon will require throughout the day has been anticipated and prepared. What strikes you most about life in the imperial household is how completely ordinary it can feel despite its extraordinary circumstances. The Emperor, for all his world historical significance, requires the same basic services as any wealthy gentleman. His clothes must be cleaned and pressed, his meals prepared and served, his correspondence organized, his living spaces maintained in perfect order. But you've learned to read the subtle signs that reveal the pressure under which this domestic routine operates. The way the head butler's voice carries a particular tension when discussing the day's schedule. The careful attention paid to the Emperor's moods by everyone, from senior courtiers to kitchen staff. The awareness that every small detail of palace management reflects not just on individual competence, but on the smooth functioning of an empire that spans most of Europe. Your primary responsibility is attending to Empress Josephine, and it is through this intimate service that you've gained your deepest insights into the private dynamics of imperial power. Josephine is 44 years old, elegant and gracious, but marked by a quality of persistent anxiety that you've come to recognize as the emotional signature of those who live in close proximity to absolute authority. She rises later than her husband, usually around 8 o'clock, and her morning routine unfolds with the elaborate precision of a religious ritual. Every detail of her appearance, from the arrangement of her hair to the selection of jewelry, must be perfect. Not because she is vain, but because she understands that her presentation is part of the larger theater of imperial legitimacy. As you help her dress, she often speaks in the low, confidential tone that intimacy between women of different social classes can create. These conversations have taught you more about the reality of living with power than any official biography or historical account could convey. He was in his study until past 3 this morning, she might say as you arrange her hair. I could hear him pacing. When he cannot sleep, he works. When he works too late, he cannot sleep. It is a cycle that concerns me. These glimpses into Napoleon's private struggles reveal a man quite different from his public image. The emperor who appears before crowds as the embodiment of confidence and decisive action becomes, in his wife's descriptions, someone wrestling with insomnia, digestive problems, and the constant mental pressure of managing an empire in a state of perpetual military and diplomatic crisis. You learn that he talks in his sleep, often mumbling about troop movements and supply lines, that he has developed nervous habits, drumming his fingers, adjusting his clothing, checking and rechecking documents that suggest an underlying anxiety his public demeanor never betrays, that he experiences moments of what Josephine delicately describes as melancholy, periods when the weight of his responsibilities seems to overwhelm even his formidable energy and determination. The Empress herself embodies the peculiar isolation that comes with being married to power rather than wielding it directly. She occupies a position of enormous privilege and influence, yet she exists primarily as an extension of Napoleon's public image rather than as an independent agent. Her opinions are sought on matters of court ceremony and social precedence, but she is excluded from the military and political discussions that consume most of her husband's attention. This creates a strange kind of loneliness, which she sometimes acknowledges during their private moments together. She is surrounded by people who defer to her elevated status, yet she has few genuine confidants. The courtiers who compete for her favor are motivated by their own ambitions rather than personal affection. Her family relationships have been complicated by the dramatic changes in their circumstances. Even her friendships are filtered through considerations of political advantage and social propriety. Sometimes I feel as though I am acting the role of Empress rather than being one. She confides one morning as you help her select a gown for an important state dinner. Every gesture, every word, every expression must be calculated for its effect. I have become a symbol rather than a person. The state dinner she's preparing for provides an excellent example of how completely personal life has been subsumed into political theater in the imperial household. The guest list has been constructed with elaborate attention to issues of diplomatic precedence and alliance politics. The menu reflects not culinary preferences, but symbolic messages about French cultural sophistication and economic prosperity. Even the seating arrangement serves multiple functions, creating opportunities for informal diplomatic conversations while reinforcing hierarchies of status and favor. You assist with the complex preparations that transform the Empress from a private individual into a public symbol. The gown she wears has been selected for its color, which must harmonize with the palace decorations while avoiding any shade that might carry unintended political connotations. Its style and its accessories. As you work, arranging her hair and applying the subtle cosmetics that will help her face maintain its composure through hours of public performance, you're struck by the transformation you witness. The anxious, sometimes melancholy woman who shares her private concerns with you gradually disappears, replaced by the serene, gracious figure who will represent French imperial dignity to an international audience. But perhaps the most revealing insights into Napoleon's character come from your observations of how he interacts with the palace staff when he believes he's unobserved. You've learned to time your movements through the corridors to catch glimpses of these unguarded moments, and they reveal aspects of his personality that rarely appear in historical accounts focused on his public actions and political decisions. He is, you've discovered, surprisingly attentive to the servants' welfare, though in a paternalistic way that reinforces rather than challenges the hierarchies that govern palace life. He notices when staff members are ill or troubled, and he ensures they receive appropriate care, but always through intermediaries rather than direct personal involvement. This creates an atmosphere of benevolent surveillance, the sense that the emperor is aware of everyone and everything within his household, but that this awareness serves his own need for control rather than genuine concern for others' well-being. His treatment of mistakes and failures reveals another dimension of his character. When errors occur, and in a household this complex, they inevitably do. Napoleon's response depends entirely on whether he perceives the mistake as resulting from incompetence or from circumstances beyond the individual's control. Incompetence he punishes swiftly and definitively, but without personal malice. It's simply a matter of maintaining the standards necessary for effective operation. But when problems arise from genuine difficulties or misunderstandings, he can display remarkable patience and understanding. This distinction reveals something important about how Napoleon understands leadership and authority. He views his household, and by extension his empire, as a vast machine that requires constant maintenance and adjustment to function properly. The people within this system are valued primarily for their contribution to its overall effectiveness rather than as individuals with their own needs and aspirations. You witness this mechanical view of human relationships most clearly during the emperor's interactions with his staff regarding his personal schedule and daily routine. Every aspect of his life has been organized to maximize efficiency and minimize disruption to his work. His meals are served at precisely scheduled times. His clothing is laid out according to detailed specifications. His personal effects are arranged in predetermined patterns that allow him to locate anything he needs without conscious thought. This obsessive attention to systematic organization extends to his emotional life as well. He has developed elaborate strategies for managing stress, controlling his temper, and maintaining the psychological equilibrium necessary for making crucial decisions under extreme pressure. He schedules time for relaxation the same way he schedules military reviews, treating personal well-being as another logistical challenge to be solved through proper planning and resource allocation. But the system's very efficiency creates its own problems. Napoleon has become so accustomed to having every aspect of his environment controlled and predictable that he struggles to adapt when circumstances don't conform to his expectations. You've observed his visible discomfort when routine disruptions occur, when meals are delayed, when clothing doesn't fit properly, when documents aren't arranged in the precise order he expects. These moments of domestic frustration provide glimpses into the psychological pressures that absolute power creates. Napoleon has constructed a life in which every detail can theoretically be controlled, yet he remains perpetually anxious about the possibility that something will go wrong. The very comprehensiveness of his control mechanisms becomes a source of vulnerability rather than strength. The most poignant example of this occurs during one of his increasingly frequent bouts of insomnia. Unable to sleep, he wanders through the palace in the early hours of the morning, checking that everything is in order, reviewing documents that have already been thoroughly examined, adjusting arrangements that were already perfect. These nocturnal inspections seem to provide him with temporary reassurance, but they also suggest a man who has become prisoner to his own need for complete control. You encounter him during one of these midnight wanderings, as you're returning from attending to a minor crisis in the Empress's apartments. He's standing in one of the smaller drawing rooms, still fully dressed despite the late hour, staring at a portrait of himself in his coronation robes. For a moment, caught off guard by your unexpected presence, his carefully maintained composure slips, and you see something approaching vulnerability in his expression. "It's a good likeness," he says, though whether he's speaking to you or to himself is unclear. The painter captured the weight of the crown quite accurately. Few people understand how heavy these symbols of authority actually are. The comment reveals more than he perhaps intended. In that brief, unguarded moment, you glimpse the man beneath the emperor, someone who experiences his power not as liberation, but as burden, who views his authority not as privilege, but as responsibility, so overwhelming that it consumes every aspect of his personal existence. As you continue through your years of service in the imperial household, you come to understand that Napoleon's tyranny operates differently from the crude domination of traditional despots. He doesn't rule through fear or violence, but through the creation of a system so comprehensive and efficient that alternatives become literally unimaginable. Everyone within his sphere, from the highest ministers to the lowest servants, becomes complicit in maintaining the very structures that constrain their own freedom. You yourself are part of this system, and you've learned to find satisfaction and even pride in your contribution to its smooth operation. The skills you've developed, the knowledge you've acquired, The relationships you've built, all of these, bind you to the imperial household in ways that transcend simple economic necessity. But in the quiet moments before dawn, as you prepare for another day of service in history's shadow, you sometimes allow yourself to wonder what it would be like to live without the constant awareness that your every action serves someone else's vision of greatness. To experience privacy that isn't provisional, relationships that aren't mediated by considerations of rank and protocol, choices that aren't constrained by the requirements of an empire. These wondering moments are brief, quickly displaced by the demands of your duties and the genuine satisfactions of competent service. But they remind you that even the most benevolent and efficient tyranny extracts a price from those who live within it. The gradual erosion of the capacity to imagine life organized according to different principles, the slow transformation of human beings into instruments of someone else's will. And as the palace awakens around you to begin another day in the service of Napoleon's ambitions, you understand that you are both witness to and participant in one of history's most seductive forms of domination, the kind that makes its subjects grateful for the privilege of their own subjugation. Conclusion: the weight of crowns. As we emerge from these four encounters with power in its most concentrated forms, we carry with us the accumulated weight of centuries, the hushed conversations of Belgian courtiers, the marble echoes of Roman excess, the orchestrated devotion of North Korean families, the intimate mechanics of French imperial household management. What connects these distant times and places is not the crude machinery of oppression that we might expect from tyranny, but something far more subtle and perhaps more troubling. The human capacity to transform domination into devotion, control into comfort, isolation into elevation. Leopold II created his golden cage through the careful management of information and the systematic exploitation of physical distance from the Congo, emotional distance from consequences, moral distance from responsibility. His courtiers participated not through fear, but through the seductive comfort of proximity to power and the gradual erosion of their capacity to imagine alternatives. Caligula retreated into a world where only creatures incapable of judgment could provide the uncomplicated acceptance he craved. His menagerie became both refuge and prison, offering him the illusion of love while accelerating his disconnection from the human world he was meant to govern. Kim Il-sung's North Korea achieved perhaps the most complete fusion of ruler and ruled, creating a society where tyranny operated through engineered love rather than fear, where every citizen became both subject and priest in a religion of state-sponsored devotion. Napoleon's household revealed how power can seduce through efficiency and competence, creating systems so comprehensive and effective that those who serve them find genuine satisfaction in their own subordination. Each of these rulers discovered, in their own way, that absolute power is also absolute isolation. The very mechanisms that protected them from challenge and contradiction also cut them off from the genuine human connection that might have saved them from their own worst impulses. And perhaps most troubling of all, each created systems that survived their individual pathologies, structures of thought, and organization that continued to shape human possibilities long after their creators had passed into history. As you settle into sleep tonight, you might reflect on the strange comfort we find in these old stories of power and its discontents. There's something reassuring about contemplating tyranny safely contained within the boundaries of historical narrative, reduced to the manageable dimensions of cautionary tale. But the deeper lesson of these stories may be how completely ordinary the people involved actually were, how recognizable their motivations, how familiar their compromises, how understandable their choices given the circumstances they faced. The capacity for tyranny, these stories suggest, lies not in some mythical realm of pure evil, but in the everyday human tendencies toward comfort, security, belonging, and the quiet satisfaction of competent service to something larger than ourselves. And with that slightly unsettling thought, we leave you to your dreams, where power has no weight and history makes no demands, where you can rest peacefully in the knowledge that these are just old stories about people long dead, with no particular relevance to the world you'll wake to tomorrow. Sleep well,